So, hello everyone, and I think we should start to have sufficient time for presentations and discussions. So hello, I'm Huda Sadda. I'm very pleased to chair this session with very interesting speakers and papers. I'll introduce the speakers first, and then each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So we'll have room for comments and discussion and questions. So the first speaker is Fida Shhaib, and Fida will be talking about breaking the silence. She's a PhD student at the University of Birmingham and interested in philosophy of science and epistemology. The second speaker will be Professor Shireen Abu Naga. Shireen Abu Naga is my colleague at Cairo University, and she's professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University and a literary critic. And her latest publication, she's published widely on women and gender and Arabic and literature, but her latest publication is Revolutionary Egypt, Gender and the New Geographies of Identity, which was published by the AUC Press in 2016. And I might as well say that we're both co-editing an issue of a journal, Cairo Papers, Cairo Studies. The third speaker is Dr. Doris Gray. She's director of the Hillary Clinton Center for Women's Empowerment at the Al Khawain University in Morocco. And her most recent, again, she's published widely, but her most recent book is entitled Women, Social Change and Law in North Africa, What Counts as Revolutionary? And this was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. I'll also mention that prior, because this is interesting, prior to being an academic, she was foreign correspondent based in South Africa and then Kenya. So the floor is yours.
Thank you all for being here. I don't know if you can hear me. So on breaking the silence, what I want to do today is develop the idea that underlying violence and discrimination against women, there's a common operating mechanism, and that's the silencing of women's voices. And the silencing takes many forms. So this is my plan. First, I will talk about what I mean by silencing of women's voices and what I mean by having a voice. I'll talk about 3 types of silencing. Then I will move on to what I call structural silencing. Then finally, I conclude by some recommendations on breaking the silence. So what is silencing? What is silencing of women's voices? The sort of silence that I mean is an imposed kind of silence. It's a silencing rather than a silence that effectively underlies women's oppression and as it subverts our rights to autonomy, privacy, freedom, and self-determination. It culminates in the unequal share of power. It allows women to endure suffering without recourse, allows perpetrators to continue to harm, crimes to go unpunished, hypocrisies to thrive, and injustices to flourish. It preserves the status quo of patriarchy. So when a culture condones sexual harassment, child marriage, rape, it silences women by objectifying them, devaluing them, and refusing to allow them a say over their own bodies. When a society tolerates domestic violence and forgives honor killings, it silences women by authorizing our murder. When a legal political system excludes and devalues women's testimony and our participation, it assumes the meaninglessness of our voices. Such examples serve well to show how silence operates as a mechanism of gender-based aggression. So what is it to have a voice? To have a voice, I intend it in the same way as Miranda Fricker intends it. To have a voice is to have the power to participate, engage, and contribute as an essential part of a family, community, and society. It's to be experienced as a person with full human rights. And to be silenced, then, is to be dismissed, dehumanized, excluded, and women are silenced in many ways. The 3 types of silencing that I talk about, agential, societal, and institutional, none is dissociated from the other. They are all feed and bleed into each other as they enhance and maintain an unjust social structure that favors women and oppresses men. In other words, patriarchy. The reason I discuss them separately is to show the systemic nature of the silencing as it cuts across all aspects of women's life. So the first type, agential silencing, is silencing inflicted by individual agents, almost always men, but could be women, through intimidation, threat, physical abuse, and sexual harassment and objectification. The second type, societal silencing, is a silencing that is enforced by the community and the society via societal norms and collective social practices. It's a silencing of women's voices through shaming, blaming, dishonoring, discrediting, and devaluing our voices. Institutional silencing is the silencing imposed by the legal, political, and religious institutions. It ensures women's voices are muted by marginalizing, excluding us from access to power and authoritative practices, and rejecting us from meaningful participation in economic, legal, and political sectors. And my examples are strictly from Lebanon. So I will give just one the example of domestic violence first. And perhaps the most well-known case of domestic violence is that of Manal Asi, who had been for 18 years battered by her husband, and finally she was murdered by in a graphic way, by her skull being crushed with a pressure cooker by her husband in front of her family and children. I take this example because some argue that it sort of was the spark that led, the final spark, let's say, that led to the Women's March in 2014, that called for the protection of women, that called for the passing of Law 293 that calls for the protection of women from family violence. So within the framework that I'm proposing, essentially, Manal Asi was silenced individually by her husband, literally, by physical force, by breaking the will also through 18 years, through isolation, threat, manipulation, and coercive control. Societally, she was silenced by her society and her family, who kind of silenced her into staying in the abusive relationship for her honor, and for the sake of her children. Institutionally, she was silenced, at least, let's say, prior to the passing of the law in 2014, by the legal system where there were no laws to protect her or to persecute her perpetrator. And law enforcement officers lacked the kind of incentive to interfere because this was a family matter, supposedly. Other examples include rape and sexual harassment, but I'm not going to go into them, but suffice it to say that in a similar way, the framework works in a similar way. The next example I want to give is that of the kafala system, or the sponsorship system. And the sponsorship system is, as you know, in Lebanon, Lebanon is a host of approximately 250,000 migrant domestic workers. And how the sponsorship or the kafala system works is that it's a legal framework that governs the residency of work and work of migrant domestic workers, most of whom are women. Under the system, the most vulnerable women, often trafficked from poorer countries, are subjected to flagrant human rights violations, including abuse and exploitation. And in that sense, I consider this a type of gender-based violence. The kafala system requires the domestic worker to live in with her employee. The general security forces refuse to renew the resident permits of those who do not reside with their employers, and it restricts their freedom of movement, makes it impossible for them to leave or change jobs, even if the work relationship is undesirable and abusive. So statistics show really quickly that as much as half are verbally abused, intimidated, threatened, a third are subjected to physical violence, whereas 1 in 10 is a victim of some form of sexual violence. The silencing is perpetuated by individual agents, the individual employer, through physical force, abuse, kind of threat, isolation, forced labor, restriction of freedom, societally through classism and racism that follows these workers outside of the home, and institutionally, as I said, general security forces refuse to renew their residency permits if they, if they don't reside with their employers and whatnot. And of course, they are excluded from forming a proper labor union. So this gets me to the structural silencing, which I think would sort of complete the framework that I'm proposing here. This is a kind of silencing that is at once subtle but very powerful. It's silencing by way of conceptualizing violent and discriminatory acts against women as individual acts of crime, as separate phenomena with separate causes and distinct instigators. So when we think of crimes and violence against women, we look at individual instances or a series of crimes of wife battery, child rape, sexual harassment, etc. And when we do that, we individuate the crimes, and we individualize the men who perpetrate these crimes, and we also inevitably individualize the women who are harmed in the process. But this leads to a limited kind of microscopic viewpoint which perceives men as singular, distinct agents or criminals rather than as units of patriarchy, and women as blameworthy for their circumstances, because we tend to think, well, she was being beaten, but other women are not, so what's wrong with her? However, when we look beyond treating these crimes as fragmented incidents, we notice two patterns emerging. First, a pattern of violence that's endorsed and fostered by patriarchal structures. And second, we see a pattern of silencing of women across all spheres of life. And when we notice these patterns, we are urged to discuss their meaning, and we kind of are urged to restructure the framework. So as I said, when acts of gendered violence are considered as separate problems with different causes, localities, and solutions, the analysis risks fragmentation and fallacy. So what does an incident of rape, well, yeah, it's just some sex-crazed man who couldn't control himself. What does that have to do with an act of wife abuse? They were having marital problems for a long time. The man has violent tendencies, but she always provoked him. What does that have to do with catcalling on the street? Her clothes were obviously too revealing, and what was she doing on the street anyway? And what does that have to do with a discriminatory law? He raped a minor, so let's abolish Article 522, which exempts the rapist if he offers to marry his victim. Also, what does that have to do with the kafala system, and so on and so forth? But it's important to note that these crimes are not anomalies, they're not exceptions, and they're not isolated incidents. They're an epidemic that women are suffering from. Their common mechanism, as I'm arguing, is silencing, and their underlying motive is patriarchy. So fragmenting and dividing the discussion of violence against women and focusing on a certain group of women serves to hide the systematicity of our oppression and the role that patriarchy plays in keeping women silent. I just want to also add one more thing, that feminist perspectives such as that clearly contribute to this kind of fragmentation, like, for example, neoliberal feminism, white feminism, or other non-intersectional feminisms, they sort of contribute to this fragmentation and to the silencing insofar as they focus strictly on gender as the only axis of oppression while dismissing other axes. Such perspectives fragment women on the basis of race. They consider women, they consider gender as the only axis here, whereas what we need to do is look beyond that, as many of my colleagues have been saying. We need to look at race, class, sexual orientation, and all other forms of oppression. For example, such kind of feminisms, if they focus exclusively on concerns of elite women, where, let's say, for example, the focus is on gender pay gap or political representation, while disregarding and excluding other feminist matters like, foreign domestic workers' rights, sexuality, personal status issues, sexual assault, sex trafficking, prostitution, and a wide range of other issues. This kind of fragments the feminist cause, I would say. And also this limited perspective, I think, partakes in a crisis for feminism, and not a crisis, not feminism in crisis. It does so by means, again, as I said, by fragmenting our voices. And when the voices are fragmented, and some voices get the loudest platform, let's say, they annul or mute other voices that are also very important. So this is what I kind of call silencing of feminism. So the framework would look something like this, based on what I've proposed. The structural kind of silencing would be sort of like the umbrella, whereas the other kinds of silencing work within that. So I propose that the discourse needs to expand beyond just the legal rights framework. It needs to encompass the underlying factors which allow men to engage in sexual assault and harassment in the first place. The fact that many men believe that they have the right to control and objectify women violently and otherwise says much about the belief system that they function within. So I just want to go beyond just the men-women kind of dichotomy here or opposition. Finally, on breaking the silence, what sort of kind of recommendations? I mean, of course, nothing less than breaking the oppressive systems. But breaking or dismantling, the oppressive system is no simple task, but I think it's a possible task. I think addressing the structural, institutional, societal, and agential silencing mechanisms, which I've outlined, is a part of it, but also, such concrete examples as calling for changes in discriminatory personal status laws, and when we change the way we socialize our sons and daughters, and when we provide, for example, safe spaces at university campuses for women to make their voices heard without feeling shamed and isolated, but also, as Alison had said before me, not being complicit in our feminism. That's also something that needs to be highlighted. So silence is a burden that belongs to most, if not all of us. I just want to end my talk by quoting Audre Lorde, who writes, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are different than my own." Thank you. I hope I kept the time. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sadda, for this kind introduction, and thank you for a wonderful paper, because it gives me, as if it has paved for me the way, just to build on it. So what has been called silencing, I call it misrecognition. The title of my paper is "Let's Grieve Over Misrecognition." It's an invitation, actually, to grieve and to feel a bit depressed over lost lives. Once this happens, grievability, recognition could take place. However, at the beginning, I need to explain a few things. My position, the context of this misrecognition, and the theoretical framework from which within I deal with all these. Now, my position, I'm a feminist, and I am committed to the radical political project that might seem now démodé. I aspire to restore the political part to the feminist agenda, which has always been there. It has always been there. Just now it's a bit nebulous. And here, I know Professor Sadda will take a fight with me. But I'm aspiring to restore this radical politicized feminist agenda instead of the docile, depoliticized agendas that have been consolidated by some, not all, NGOs and the conventions of the UN. I cannot also overlook the sexual politics in the MENA region. And simultaneously, I cannot pretend that it is only women who are paying the dear price for the dream of change. I cannot not take men into consideration if I'm really bent on engaging politically with gender issues. However, while all forms of gender are subject to unheard forms of precarity, women still get the bigger share. For example, the experience of shoveling a knife into the vagina is just unique to women. So we can never negotiate the specificity of the female body. Now, precarity stems from this, that these violations are negotiable. Once we negotiate such violations, then precarity is there. I'm trying to investigate the concepts of precarity and misrecognition that have come recently to characterize the gendered subject in the MENA region and suggest I'm trying also to suggest what is to be done to rescue women's studies and gender studies from turning into boring and aging syllabi that function as a mere accumulation of credit hours in the academia. Butler, I'm working with the definition given by Judith Butler of precarity. Precarity is that politically induced notion in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. This is the definition I'm using throughout the paper, along with the concept of redistribution advanced by Nancy Fraser. Redistribution in order to destabilize all existing identities and norms. Of course, this is not an easy task. I mean, even if I try to do that, it's not an easy task. It's mission impossible. That's why I have limited very much the scope of the paper, and I'm looking at what can be done in the circles of the academia. So I'm dealing with two things, the cultural studies and gender studies. I'm thinking of the syllabi. However, I believe that I also have to tell you what inspired me to work on this. Two things. First of all, that over-researching graffiti, songs, dances, paintings, these products have become over-researched, and on the way, they lost their the origin from where they sprang. That was the revolutions. So we forgot somehow about the political side, and we are immersed, deeply immersed into the aesthetic sides of these products. But we never forget to say, this is women's agency, subjectivity formation, but we lost the political side. And the graffiti itself has been wiped. They have all been wiped, and they are archived. But we forgot the very first part, the main pillar on which these products were based. This is one thing, and I've been noticing that the MAs and PhDs in the humanities departments are really dealing with this a lot, extensively. I'm not saying that these are not important, I'm just saying that these products form the superstructure of gender and not the infrastructure. The other thing that inspired me to work on this is an article that was published on Open Democracy last year by the Turkish feminist Denise Kendiotti, and it's called the Triple Whammy. And she's claiming in that article that the struggle for women's rights is in the demise, along with all feminist coalitions. And she's explaining the triple whammy, globalization, accusing feminism of being imperial, and finally that feminism is playing a very weak head because of all the precarity in the region, of course, because of imperialism, the charge of imperialism. And I thought, why not? I might try as well and find some solutions in the area of academia, because all this is happening because we misrecognize it. And if we misrecognize, we are not to grieve. So they are all interconnected. I'll just give very few examples of what I mean by precarity. When I was writing, the first example that came to my mind was the Iraqi women. The Iraqi women are a perfect example for that. Then the Yazidi women, and there was a session in the morning about, there was a paper about Yazidi women, because those women really, their position is very complicated. Christian women in North Sinai and Mosul, they are very much similar in their suffering. The rape camps in South Sudan, the girls are just incarcerated there and they are called rape camps, and everybody knows. everybody will. And finally, the daily acts of sexual harassment everywhere, as if this has become the norm. And of course, this all culminated in the Me Too hashtag. So what can we do? Why we are not recognizing this? Why people cannot recognize this as precarity? Why people insist that one life must be lost for another to live? These are all questions that are posed by Butler in her very interesting book, Frames of War. Sexual politics is part of those frames. Sexual politics are used in order to sustain all the wars. How much do I have left? That's good. So, how to break these frames? How can we find a loophole to reveal the falsity of these normative frames? What is the rationale behind these frames of precarity? While Butler advocates a movement, a coalition, to form an oppositional bloc that could stand against all justified forms of violence, Nancy Fraser calls for a transformative approach that aims at, I quote her, restructuring the underlying generative framework, unquote. In other words, by destabilizing existing group identities and differentiations, these remedies would not only raise the self-esteem of members of currently disrespected groups, they would change everyone's sense of belonging, affiliation, and self. So we're not talking here about reformation, we're aiming at transformation. The feminist scholarship in the academia is a very powerful tool for knowledge production. And it could be one of the most practical routes to destabilize existing norms. If feminist scholarship redirects its attention to the frames of precarity, power relations that sustain them are bound to be subverted. And this is where grievability and recognition begin. Yet before campaigning for that, we need to revisit the epistemic frame of feminist scholarship in the humanities. And of course, I'm just referring to a few examples, because I cannot archive all that. Focusing on the curricula, for example, could provide a possible point of departure. This is because the theoretical framework of the feminist gender, women's syllabi, offered in the Humanities department of the MENA universities, govern the kind of knowledge produced and the visions underlying it. A quick survey of the canonical texts, if I can say so, that comprise the curricula reveals that women's empowerment has become the ruling concept. Yet, that women are still forced into early marriages, taken as sex slaves, harassed, and incarcerated simply negate any kind of empowerment. And one wonders how a curriculum could claim so. In the case of literary studies, one notices the high interest in analyzing women's voices and the means of resistance in a way that obscures and even cuts any links with external reality. That is, everything happens in the text, which in turn replaces reality, although it is an event in the world. The text is an event in the world. Pedagogically speaking, it should be made clear that the text offers an alternative view of dealing with reality, but not reality itself as a totality. Instead of such vanilla texts, curricula must be designed in a way that reflects, engages with, and challenges the norms that validate precarity. The feminist project won't be repoliticized without confronting the status quo that never fails to legitimize precarity. Spivak's Women's Time could be a guiding example if we need to raise awareness of precarity in the curriculum. And of course, there is the importance of the transnational approach. Instead of just working, in seclusion, the transnational approach is very important, and I'm taking Inder Pal Gruwal and Karen Kaplan as an example in their, thank you, in their book, Introduction to Women's Studies. Then as for the other thing that I'm trying to use in order to repoliticize the agenda to pave the way for recognition is what I call Artivism. Artivism, Artivism, it's the combination of art and activism. By now it's called Artivism. So I'm thinking of this as something that should be encouraged by feminist studies, to be studied and to be constructed. So for example, there was an exhibition a few months ago in Cairo organized by many parties, but one of them is here, Women and Memory. Don't worry, it was called Don't Worry, I'm Doing Fine, or I'm Okay. This is a kind of artivism without forgetting about the aesthetic side. I believe that all exhibitions of curated by Palestinian artists are also part of this artivism. So we cannot take just art out of the whole paradigm. I mean, we need to combine both, and also we need to look at this academically, to take these products as new texts. These are new texts, and this is cultural studies after all. But to keep hold of the political side all the time, this is what I am after, because simply we have to remember that the law and justice are not the same thing. And social justice that we have been working for all that time does not necessarily mean gender justice. So what I'm aspiring to is recognition that will lead to grievability. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. So my presentation hopefully segues into the previous ones. In tying it to the title of this conference, Feminism in Crisis, I'm more talking about feminism in times of crisis. And I would like to focus on scholarship, or rather the absence of scholarship, on indirect victims. And here I'm talking about Tunisia, 7 years after the revolution. When I proposed my paper, that's why in the title, in the program, it says 6 years after the revolution, but now we are actually 7 years after the uprising. So what has happened to indirect victims? And who are indirect victims? Once a dictatorship is overthrown, or once there has been a change of system, we often have a period that is called transitional justice. This transitional justice mechanisms comprises primarily 4 different mechanisms. Criminal justice, truth seeking via truth commissions, reparations, that includes financial, medical, or psychosocial support, and institutional reform. These are needed in times when state-sanctioned crimes or state-sanctioned human rights violations occurred during the time of dictatorship. Tunisia was very quick, very swift in creating a comprehensive transitional justice law within months after the overthrow of Ben Ali. That comprehensive transitional justice law included women and children, meaning women and children who were affected by state oppression by being related to a male member who was the person who was in prison. So just to make clear what I mean, or what is meant by direct and by indirect victims. A direct victim of state crimes is a person who is incarcerated, tortured, discriminated, oppressed on account of his or her activities or activism. An indirect victim, mostly women and children, are relatives of an incarcerated person who are oppressed, discriminated, harassed on account of being related to someone who is labeled an enemy of the state. Why is it important to focus on these indirect victims? First of all, they are a much larger group than the ones who actually were in prison. And it's a much less clearly defined group of people. What did these women and children suffer from while their husbands or fathers were in prison? They suffered from economic deprivation. The women lost their jobs or were not given jobs at a time when they're in effect were single mothers, single heads of household, in a society where single motherhood is very much problematic. They were harassed by the police, which includes sexual harassment, at a time when the police knew that there was no man in the home. The police would routinely come to the homes of these families at night. They were, in effect, suffering from extreme social isolation and exclusion. As for the children, they were often expelled from school, or they were failed exams so often that eventually they dropped out of school. What are the consequences of this type of suffering? And since 2011, I've been probably interviewing 400 or 500 women. So it's been an ongoing project. And I've come to certain conclusions of what happens when people are indirect victims and what are the consequences. The first consequence is the destruction of the family. When a father is in prison, is tortured, sexually abused, when the mother is a single mother without a job, is harassed, sexually violated by authorities, the children are alienated from their fathers, whom they don't know because he's in prison. If we consider that the family is the smallest unit of society and that family is destroyed, willfully destroyed, it is very difficult to construct a sane or healthy society. Violence against women in particular, sexual violence, in a society where the honor of a family rests within women's virtue, so-called virtue. When that is taken away, there is enormous shame, guilt, self-loathing, frustration that often then spills over into violence within the family. For the men who return from torture chambers, they very often are incapable of resuming normal marital relationships or healthy family relationships. There is, by the way, in the Lebanese context, a good book by Salome Anderson, the daughter of Terry Anderson, who was held in captivity in Lebanon for 7 years. And his daughter wrote a book on what the results on her are of having grown up with a hero of a father who was in prison, and when he came back out of prison, he wasn't quite the hero that her family told her he was, on account of his experiences in prison. Fourth, a society in which most members have lived in fear of the state, in fear of betrayal by their families, in fear of betrayal by their neighbors or by their community, cannot move into a smooth transition to democracy. free and democratic societies, in my understanding, depend on a basic measure of trust and confidence of members towards each other and trust in institutions. When that trust is completely eroded, as is the case in Tunisia, it is very difficult to expect that these societies can smoothly, swiftly move from dictatorship into a democratic society. I will give you just one very small example from one of the interviews I did. One of the mothers I talked to ended up as a single mother. She lost her job once her husband was incarcerated. She was the mother of 4 sons without a job. Her family would not help her because the family felt, you are married to this criminal. You're endangering the entire family. So she was completely isolated, also from her extended family. Her children kept failing exams at school to the point that eventually they dropped out of school without any kind of education, and being the son or daughter of a criminal, could not find any meaningful employment or any employment at all. And what did they do? They went to Iraq and joined ISIS because they offered them some honor, they offered them some income. And this woman said, pleading with her son, who was in Iraq, to come back to Tunisia. And he said, why should I come back to a country that only humiliates me, prior to the revolution and after the revolution? And that was the last she heard from her son. He was subsequently killed. So focusing on indirect victims, I think, is a task for feminist scholarship, or scholarship in general. And there is an absence of any kind of scholarship, to my knowledge, that focuses on indirect victims of state violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentations, and I think I'll just immediately open the floor to discussion and questions. Let's wait on her. Yeah, no questions. Yes, let's not ask questions until she comes back.
My question is for Huda. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really love the way that you framed the idea of fragmentation of feminism, that fragmentation comes because of this mainstream feminism, consumerist feminism, white feminism, whatever has it, and that causes the fragmentation rather than the narrative that I think we hear more often, which is that, oh, feminism is fragmented because of these internal divisions, or because we are all, some people focus on sexuality and some people focus on LGBTQ rights or whatever it is. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that and talk us through that concept a little bit. I found it very helpful.
So let's take questions, and then I think we'll respond to them.
Right, Francis?
Okay, Francis.
Should I say? Yeah, I just have I enjoyed the panel. I found Shaheen's, intervention productive of my thoughts and hold on, sorry, I got disoriented, but I have a lot of notes. I wanted to mention a book that I have fallen in love with in the last year by Grace, sorry, I have a cough drop, by Grace Hong. It's called Death Beyond Disavowal. And I guess I just want us to, even though it's in English and she's an Asian American scholar, and she works on East Asia, she works on race, she works in cultural studies, she's in Los Angeles. But this book, I think, is interesting because you're talking about academic feminism, and she's if you have to leave, if you have to, anytime, I'll stop. You know,
don't worry, I'll drive after.
So I just think the way in which she talks about race and sexuality and gender and the academy is really very fruitful. But her entire logic is that, you know, that certain feminists always knew that health and life for some people is built on death and illness for other people. I mean, it sounds like we know it, we kind of know it, but it's an interesting theoretical framework. The way in which some feminists always knew that the whole system, before neoliberalism became, or before Nancy Fraser or Judith Butler talked about precarity, or that, and she specifically looks at the first generation of Black academic feminists, and she has a chapter on Chicana, you know, feminists, and she looks at actually their high rates of death from cancer and diabetes. So that first generation died young. She tracks them from the, but anyway, so I just wanted to recommend that. But when I wanted to say something practical about why are people studying cultural products. I mean, I'm not Egyptian, but I have become scared to study a lot, you know, a lot of other kinds of things, and I think a lot of us are sort of stuck with texts. For someone like me who'd rather talk to people as well, and so I wonder if that's some of it, that all of us are going into a little bit of safe hiding when we study Egypt, and we're looking at these things that, and we know, I feel it, we know we're missing, but then it's also not safe, and it's not safe for Egyptians either. So it's not just the non-Egyptian, as all the Egyptians know. So those are my
Thank you for three very extremely interesting talks. My first question or comment really is to combine Frida and Shireen's in talking about silencing and so on. I'm wondering if you've noticed, as I have, that in almost all the papers I've heard since we've in this conference, all our reference seem to be from the West. I'm not doing West bashing. Please don't misunderstand me or anything like that. I'm just wondering why we don't have more references, even in this place, to Arab sources and Eastern sources, India, etc. So, and I think these are all tied up together. These questions are all tied up together. The things we read as feminists, the things we discuss as feminists, and the voices that we produce. So I think it's just a question, and as I said, please, once more, I'm not doing West bashing. I'm just trying to understand this. For your, sorry, your name, Doris. Your transition of justice was very interesting to me, because we in this country, you said in times of crisis, of course we live in this part of the world in absolutely permanent crisis, so I'm not sure we can distinguish a time of crisis, but we did have a civil war in this country for 15 years, in which something like 150,000 people died and so on. And at the end of it, or what was called the end of it, because I'm not sure it has ended, a general amnesty was declared. And the idea was, this is of course not the same kind of thing you're talking about. You're talking about after revolution, I'm talking about after war. And even looking forward to the day when, perhaps, we will have a peace, a real peace in this part of the world, we're going to have to face this again. What do you do with people who did horrible things? That's a question. And the thing is that during a war like the one we had here, and everywhere, I suppose, I mean, why are some wars more terrible than other wars? You know, they're all the same. Innocent people die, innocent people get tortured, innocent people suffer. the end of it, the discussion was here, it's just too big a question, we can't do it. We can't handle taking every single person who participated in this war and trying to we have neither the time nor the resources. Let's just forget about it. The result is, of course, that we still have much of the leadership of the war is still in power today. So there's a big question for me there. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about, you talked about the women who have been, well, I think you used the phrase silent victims or the
Indirect victims.
Indirect victims. Here we've had experience, of course, with prison camps, the Israeli prisoners, especially the Hezbollah women who were taken prisoner, tortured, we know, and deny, and had to deny, when they came out of prison. Most of them, as you said, were taken because of their brothers or fathers or husbands or something, and were tortured in order to get them to talk and to give information. This is the knowledge we have, and it could be wrong because they have been silenced. And they're silenced because they don't want to acknowledge that they were in there. They don't want to acknowledge that they had a problem, that maybe they were raped, because then, so they're sort of twice suffering, and become, if they were indirect, they became direct victims immediately. And I'm a bit hesitant about always talking about women as victims of war, as if men weren't, because I'm the mother of 3 young men who luckily were not taken into any army because of their ages, but I don't want them to suffer and die the way soldiers do. That's what I just wanted to make.
Hi, thank you so much for the information that you guys gave to us. And it's really sad that we live in a world that we normalize the gender gap between men and women, and also we live in a world that enslaving people and killing innocent people became a symbol of pride also. But you know, in my mind, I usually think that us as women sometimes silence ourselves, especially when you are coming from the third world. You will see, like growing up, you will see many women who are telling me, don't do this because you are a girl, don't speak up. And you will see some mothers who are telling their children, don't act like a girl. So having these social norms growing up, that will also impact you. So I believe, and I just want to ask you too, that we cannot be free until we free ourselves, until us as a woman can come together and educate each other and like try to destroy the cultural and the gap between us as women. Because if we always say, oh, some of our rights are taken away by men, while some women might not be in the same page with you, we will never achieve anything. Thank you.
Thank you for your talks. This question is addressed to all 3 of you, if you want to answer. Okay, so I think it's great that we're having these discussions and panels. You know, it's a great way, it's a great step towards change, but I still feel like we're kind of in our own little bubble here. Doris, you mentioned that we have to take steps and change the way things are going, especially towards the indirect victims. What can we do outside of these walls? What can we do? Like, after this is over, everyone goes about their daily lives. What's going to happen next? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. My question is in regards to breaking the silence. I really like how you talked about like the structural system. You said it was like an umbrella, but I was wondering, what do you have to say about the silencing of women due to factors of imperialism, like occupation or drone strikes, like where exactly does that fall? Do you consider that part of like women who have literally been rendered silent? Yeah, that's it.
Hello, thank you for the panel. It was refreshing, really. I will start by a question for Dr. Fida. How would you think of, because you're talking about silencing but also violence, how do you think of anger management for men? Because there's a lot of framing that these men are angry, that's why they hit their wife. So I would like to, if possible, a critical take on that in specific. And Dr. Shireen, okay. You said a lot of things that resonate with me a lot, especially about empowerment, like how empowerment have become a language in which we like empower women and there's no power in the structures in which this happened. So can you say a bit more about how can we challenge actually this in the academia, like the professors we relate to and that are on the kind of, we agree with politically, keep fighting for that, but there are bigger structures. So how can we challenge this in specific in order to make a feminist curriculum that resonate with us? And Professor Doris, how would your project look like on this question if instead of looking at family as an example of society, how would it look like if kind of you looked at family as an oppressive structure for women? And there's a lot of feminist projects that aim to deconstruct it and maybe destroy it because it is oppressive to women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very rich, all the presentations. My questions first is Fida, about your conceptualization of the silencing. I think it's a very important concept and it's very intriguing, but I just want to think together like whether maybe you are stretching too much the meaning of silencing, because what you are talking about, as also Oba mentioned, includes some kind of accommodation from women themselves, like women also generation by generation teach how to accommodate in the existing systems and everything. It also includes, I think, this, so it's not only, so women are not necessarily silenced, but I understand what you mean is kind of a broader accommodation to the system. That's my reading. And also, for example, silencing sometimes is defined in literature, sometimes as also resistance, especially in the some women of marginalized communities. For example, the Roma in Europe, they don't speak, for example, necessarily about their problems to the non-Roma Europeans because they feel that threats may come in. That was just comments. And then connecting to your presentation, to Shireen's presentation, you had the list of what can we do, and then maybe you can show it again, but I missed actually what Shireen was saying, like we need to deal with the more precarious issues and we need to get more political, but of course there's the issue of fear again, also Frances mentioned, like how to overcome this fear and taboo and how to deal with the more precarious situations. Thank you.
Can I ask a question too? So actually, and to follow up on Maya's point, really, it's to talk about feminist syllabi. And let me just say that so in perspective and some comparative perspectives, if we look at the MENA region, before 2000, we had basically 2 women's studies programs in the entire region. We were talking that we have the Birzeit and actually the LAU, and there was nothing. But since 2000, we have over 25. And all these women's studies programs are really the product or the product of what is known as Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, right? Because in the MDGs, it was recognized gender and education was an important goal, and money was put into this whole idea of establishing women's studies programs in Arab and MENA region right, in Arab universities. This is what I know. And since then, we've had over 25. I don't know. I'm not counting anymore. So my point is that if you look at all these programs, all of them without exception, or at least I don't know of an exception, that they're all about policy, and they're not cultural studies programs, really.
No.
I mean, no. But so they're all policy, and I mean, the AUC one is on policy and something. The one that we established at Cairo University is development and gender. So this is the structure. So these are the structural issues there. They're very different from other women's studies programs that were established maybe 70s and 80s by feminists, and that were more engaged with the women's movement and so on. So bearing in mind these very different histories, how would you address this issue of, it's not bringing back politics, because politics was never part of that, right? So it's what do you do about that? And the other thing, could you comment a little bit on, okay, because we belong to the same department, so this is like a bit incestuous, I'm sorry about that, but could you comment a little bit about, because you see the Department of English is a bit different, because we've become a gender hub type of thing, the whole thing. So my feeling is that you're reacting to that, which is really interesting, because to what extent is this directing your analysis? And because I totally agree with you in that sense, but the cultural component in our department is non-existent in other programs. So it's really interesting to think about, right? Because we don't have a women's studies program, but we have feminist women who are teaching literature and talking gender and culture. So I don't know, what would you say to that? Okay, so I think we have 10 minutes, fantastic. So 4 minutes for each one of you. Would you like to start with
Me? Okay. Well, there are so many questions. First, I want to thank you all for all the questions. I'm going to try as much as I can to address them all. I'm going to start with Asli and Opa because the question was similar. You talked about what about silence that is a form of resistance, and right, in my paper I discussed that kind of silence, but I differentiate it from silencing, which is a kind of imposed silence rather than a freely chosen silence. So yes, there is another kind of silence, which is a freely chosen silence, and it could be, a kind of positive type of silence, let's say, in that sense. Secondly, right, okay, there's, women can be complicit in their silencing, and they can be also agents of silencing. That's why I said, mostly, within the agential sort of framework, mostly men do the silencing, but it's also true that some women do the silencing also as well. And there's also, they can be complicit in their own silencing, and they can actually be agents of silencing at times. So yes, that I would agree with you on that, absolutely. As far as, I'm going to try as much as I can to answer all the questions. I think there was a question about the kind of activism that could be done, and what can we do after we leave here. Absolutely true, I agree with you, but I also just want to kind of refer to some of the talks that Dr. Jad was saying during her session yesterday, during the plenary session, that theory and praxis go hand in hand. So and it's also always contextual and all of that. So I think theory needs activism, and activism needs theory in the same way. So, but of course, we endorse. I mean, I as much as I can, but I don't think feminists, at least many of us, if not most, are, just are in like the ivory tower of academia and don't do much further than that. I hope not, at least. Okay, anger management for men. What do I think of that? Well, I mean, there's, like the whole toxic masculinity issue and the reshaping of all that. One of the recommendations that I proposed is the thinking about how we socialize our children, our sons and daughters. This is one thing we could do to kind of think about how we could reformulate what it means to be a male in this society. Sometimes, some kind of sometimes some sort of reforms or some sort of interventions are needed. In the case of anger management interventions, perhaps because that's what we have now and that's what we need to deal with. It's a very complex situation, and I wish I had straight answers to many of these things. That's why we're all here and we're all discussing these things. So it's a process, just like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to just say, it's a process to kind of end the reply, but that's all I have to say right now. The question about what it means, where I center silencing in terms of occupation. Yes, within the framework, of course, this would be partly, I think it would go through all the four types, essentially by actual, soldiers that are doing the silencing, but also all the way to the structure. But I would, because I'm trying to reframe the whole task of feminism to push it away from, men-women sort of antagonism, and make it more like, a part of what the structures that we all live in, both men and women. So occupation and imperialism and all these big topics would go within that framework. Just one more question, I don't know, Dr. Makdisi, about the silencing of voices from the Middle East in the references. I absolutely agree with you. I confess to not having many, voices, theoretical voices at least, in my paper, but I, referenced perhaps activists or NGOs and whatnot, but you're absolutely right, and I'm completely guilty in that. Right, and Alison, I don't know, I'm just going to give the talk to the others. If I have time, I'll answer your question. Really, apologies about that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I apologize if I have left, but I had that fit of coughing. Apologize for that.
Sorry, you had that.
I'll begin with the, I believe, Huda and Francis, if I answered that, they're similar in many ways. But I don't have anything against the cultural or cultural studies. No, I don't. I'm aiming at restoring the political side of feminism in its intertwinement with the personal and cultural. See what I mean? Because I have noticed recently that most MA and PhD candidates, they just look at the songs, for example, like that, with blinkers, while these songs are part of a wider context. And politics need the context. So I cannot study just songs in the air like that, as if they came from nowhere, or the graffiti as if it came from nowhere. And we keep celebrating. There is this celebratory mood, women's agency, women's voices, which was there, but in the past. See, we need to look at these products from another perspective. At least as part of memory, politics of memory, But this separation really worries me. The whole thing comes down to just the static sides and women's voices, and that's it. So I have nothing against cultural studies. And when I say we need to restore the political, it's the resistance part in the whole project of feminism. It's all about subverting power relations. So this is what I keep thinking of. Why do we teach a novel? And I keep saying the characters, setting, plot, then what? Nothing. That's it. See? So I need to find a link, I need to find the loophole, I need to go back and read, for example, Azar Nafis's reading Lolita in Tehran. Maybe that can help, see? And we need to remember bell hooks, teaching to transgress. We need to teach to transgress. Of course, as you said, there are all those dangers and all that, but we must find other exits. We must find other exits. The curricula or the syllabus, whenever I design it, I think of two things. Planetary thinking, I want to base it on planetary thinking, and the transnational approach, because really this, it helps the students to understand more. So if we take it horizontally on the level of planetarity and then transnational, this helps a lot, that it's not only one form, it's not in one place, it's not one time. This mono, we need to, we need to work on this mono. Let's get rid of it. Maybe if we put things in a wider context, that could lead to recognition. Jean, I know, but I couldn't, this is what we work with. These books is what we work with. I know. No, I know it's not an accusation or anything. And I really don't have an answer, except that this is knowledge, and let's consider it a universal heritage, Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I chose those, because of course, I always say that not any book and that's it. No. I need to know the position of the critic herself. See, her position concerns me. Yeah. But interesting, wallahi.
With regards to amnesty, very important. Tunisia last fall passed a reconciliation law. And what was the result of passing that reconciliation law? A massive uprising. Because reconciliation cannot be imposed from above. It has to have the consent of those who have been violated. So when the state passed a reconciliation law, say, bringing back the former oppressors, it resulted in another uprising. So I very strongly believe that transitional justice can only work when it's victim-based and not when it's government-centered. In that process, I think it's important to recognize that not all victims are saints and not all oppressors are devils. Sometimes it's a matter of chance where you end up in history, on which side you end up. And Tunisia is a very small country with a fairly small population. People have to find new ways of living together. They see each other in the street, they know each other. Torturer and tortured. So they have to find new ways of living with each other. Part of that role can be played by the government or this transitional justice process, but also a large part has to come from the people who have been violated before. And the first step is that they are heard, that their voices are heard. So before you move from looking at women as survivors, it first has to be recognized that they were victims. And then they can move from being victims to survivors. But you cannot surpass that step, not recognizing what had actually happened to them. With regards to being silenced, the Truth Commission in the Tunisian Truth Commission is the only commission of this kind that has the word dignity in the title. It's the Truth and Dignity Commission. Women presented their dossiers and they also testified, but very often it was their own families that didn't want them to testify, in particular about sexual violence. So great care was taken that they could testify in private, that they could testify in their homes, that somebody from the Truth Commission would come to their house and record their statements. But it was, in that case, not the state. The state said women need to come forward. The transitional justice law encouraged women to come forward. But then it was their own families that did not want them to come forward. To your questions about what we can do, maybe it's my journalist background, but I've moved away from just publishing in academic journals that are read by 50 people to publishing in, sorry, I do publish in those, but I'm very aware that we are publishing for each other. My reports on transitional justice, women and transitional justice, I try to publish them with policy journals to affect policy or influence or shape international and domestic policy. So that's the one small step I can take. Other people can take other steps, I'm sure. With regards to the family, transitional justice is supposed to address wrongs of the past. So if these wrongs of the past were committed to the family as it existed then, that needs to be recognized. However, a transitional justice process, in my view, is never complete when it does not lead to new gender norms. That is a very integral part of transitional justice, and probably the most complicated part. How do we understand, how is women's understanding of themselves changing as a result? How is society's understanding of women changing? How are families changing? These are all important parts of a transitional justice process. Changing of gender norms. So I fully agree that in that process also the oppression that occurs within the family has to be recognized. But that's for the future. Transitional justice is supposed to address the crimes committed by the state against individuals and families. Thank you.
So, can we do that? I mean, we can continue the conversation, I think. I mean, we can always continue over lunch. Of course, go ahead.
Before we go to lunch, the dinner has been moved up, so we're going to have, for conference participants, the dinner is now at 7 instead of 8 in West Hall.
And 7,
no one heard me?
7. No.
7. Do you want to?
Dinner at 7.
Not at 8.
Okay. Not at 8. Dinner at 7. Yes. Thank you, Sarah. So